Buonasera, potremmo intitolare questa conferenza Gli irriducibili. E quindi viva gli irriducibili. E d'altra parte la guerra è stata molto lunga e logorante e questo ciclo di conferenze che si sta avviando alla fine è stato anch'esso molto lungo e probabilmente per qualcuno logorante. Ma noi siamo contenti di andare avanti, di arrivare alla fine. Già arrivare alla fine è una buona cosa. Allora vi ricordo che oltre alla conferenza di oggi, di cui la collega professoressa Lorenzini introdurrà il relatore, l'amico Leonhard, che sono molto contento di salutare qui a Trento, la prossima e ultima conferenza, giuro, ultima, e io non ne organizzo più perché ci tengo anche alla salute vostra e mia. Si svolgerà il 22 maggio alle 17:30, non il 20 come talvolta era scritto, quindi ci spostiamo dal mercoledì al venerdì e il motivo è che il venerdì alla sera, dopo un'ora circa dalla fine della conferenza, ci sarà uno spettacolo pirotecnico, nel senso metaforico. La conferenza del 22 sarà dedicata al tema della musica e la guerra e sarà tenuta dal professor Carlini, che insegna musicologia, che è un trentino, ma insegna musicologia all'università, al Conservatorio di Brescia ed è uno studioso proprio dei rapporti tra guerra e musica. Ma alle 20:30 lo stesso professor Carlini introdurrà all'Auditorium Santa Chiara il coro della SAT. Quindi il 22 maggio, per il collega Leonhard che non è italiano, il coro della SAT è il più importante e più antico, prestigioso coro alpino, non solo del Trentino ma in Italia, noto a livello internazionale. Quindi alla sera del 22 maggio alle ore 20:30 in auditorium il Dipartimento offrirà alla cittadinanza e soprattutto agli irriducibili, per i quali saranno riservate le prime 4 file della... No, la prima dobbiamo riservarla al sindaco, a quelle robe lì, ma dalla seconda in poi voi dite sono un irriducibile e allora avrete... Ecco, è ovviamente aperto alla cittadinanza ed è un concerto gratuito. Quindi parlate, ovviamente faremo nelle prossime settimane una capillare informazione con manifesti, comunicati a ogni sorta, però insomma se siete interessati e vi piace, insomma penso che chiudere con il coro della SAT sia bello. Ci auguriamo che sia bello e che susciti che susciti attenzione e partecipazione da parte della gente. Ora, prima di dare la parola alla collega che introdurrà il professor Leonhard, dovremo affrontare un piccolo problema organizzativo. Il professor Leonhard parla un perfetto inglese, perché ha studiato a lungo a Oxford o a Cambridge, una delle due, Oxford. Quindi parla un inglese perfetto. Noi ci saremmo attrezzati, la collega Lorenzini, che parla anche lei un ottimo inglese, per una sorta di consecutiva, cioè non una vera e propria consecutiva, ma ogni 2 o 3 pagine del testo del professor Leonhard, che vi posso garantire legge un inglese assolutamente da manuale, quello del, com'è che si chiama quello che va in televisione, che fa i corsi di lingue... Sloan, là, ecco, molto meglio, lui molto meglio, quindi è molto comprensibile, però se c'è veramente, se qualcuno di voi giustamente vorrebbe almeno un sunto che si fa ogni 10 minuti, un sunto in italiano, la collega Lorenzini è ben disposta a farlo, però ve lo chiederei, nel senso che se tutti, come dire, pensate di capire un perfetto inglese parlato da un tedesco, ma perfetto, potremo procedere con il perfetto inglese. Ci saranno anche delle slide che ci aiutano. Ma siccome siamo in democrazia, almeno ancora per un po', se... No, non c'è riferimento all'Italicum, naturalmente. Non c'è riferimento all'Italicum. Vi va bene così? Cioè, va bene che andiamo in inglese? Volete la... chi vuole l'interruzione, come dire? Ok, perfetto. Allora non c'è mica da... Esatto. È una cosa, è chiaro che le generazioni magari più giovani l'inglese lo masticano più di generazioni un po' meno giovani che magari masticano il francese o il tedesco piuttosto che l'inglese. Va bene, allora procederemo come abbiamo pensato. Era solo una...
Ma abbiamo temuto, voleva dire. Sì, grazie a tutti per essere venuti e grazie al professor Leonard per essere qui. Siamo a conclusione del ciclo e si parla oggi della conclusione della guerra, si parla della pace, la pace di Versailles, composita, una pace che da tanti è stata definita una pace non finita, anzitutto perché la guerra in fondo, quando la pace è stata negoziata, non era finita. Tanto che recentemente la storiografia ha pensato di riflettere sulle periodizzazioni che noi applichiamo alla durata della Prima Guerra Mondiale, anticiparne l'inizio, perfino posticiparne senz'altro la fine. Lo sentiremo anche nella relazione del professor Leonard fra poco. Abbiamo un tedesco che ci parla della pace di Versailles, perché io penso che il concetto che suona nelle orecchie di tutti quando sentono Versailles è diktat, la percezione della pace che domina la narrativa relativa alla pace di Versailles, che è la percezione tedesca della pace di Versailles. Siamo molto contenti di avere qui Leonard, perché l'abbiamo invitato perché ha scritto un bellissimo libro, che è questo, Die Büchse der Pandora, Geschichte des Ersten Weltkriegs, il vaso di Pandora, storia della Prima Guerra Mondiale. Il titolo si riferisce forse lo dirà anche lui, richiama il lavoro di Thomas Mann, perché questo libro, che vi consiglio e che spero verrà tradotto, il Mulino già ha tradotto dei suoi libri, ora introdurrò anche il curriculum per bene del nostro illustre ospite, dicevo che ha già tradotto un suo libro recentemente, che è uscito in traduzione nel 2014 col titolo, però il titolo lo vado a cercare, Imperi e Stati Nazionali nell'Ottocento, e speriamo che traduca anche questo, a meno che non ritenga che il mercato ormai, come anche la questione degli irriducibili delle conferenze, che il mercato ormai non sia saturo di libri sulla Prima Guerra Mondiale. Forse no, spero di no, sarebbe un peccato, perché questo libro veramente è molto bello, lo faccio rivedere, anche se noi abbiamo la proibizione assoluta di fare vedere qualsiasi libro, perché pare che, essendo l'Università di Trento anche casa editrice, avendo noi delle collane editoriali, facciamo propaganda alla concorrenza, ma insomma. Il compito di introdurre il professor Leonard è graditissimo e difficilissimo, perché guardate, mi sono detta prima di venire qui, va bene, adesso mi stampo il curriculum, erano 40 pagine, e allora cercherò di fare un riassunto, visto che oggi starò a riassumere tutto, riassumo anche il curriculum. Il professor Leonard, già l'ho accennato Gustavo Corni prima, Ha studiato a Oxford e a Heidelberg, e è attualmente direttore di un importantissimo centro di studi storici, il centro di studi avanzati, della scuola di storia nel centro di studi avanzati che si chiama FRIAS, dell'Università di Friburgo, scuola che dirige e che ha contribuito a fondare. I temi di cui ha scritto, e ha scritto moltissimo, in tedesco e in inglese soprattutto, naturalmente, sono molto ampi. Il professor Leonard si occupa di storia comparata sostanzialmente, e di imperi e stati nazionali, come il libro che vi citavo prima. Ha scritto di nazionalismo, ha scritto anche però il suo primo libro di liberalismo. E ora ci annunciava prima dell'inizio del nostro incontro che il tema di cui ci parlerà oggi è il tema su cui sta proseguendo le sue ricerche dopo aver scritto delle origini e dello svolgimento del conflitto mondiale. Adesso si dedicherà a parlare delle paci, e quindi questa, diciamo, è il primo sguardo in queste sue nuove ricerche, e noi gli siamo molto grati che le presenti proprio qui da noi. Grazie, cedo la parola.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me being here in Trento, and whereas English and American colleagues have a reputation for starting their presentations with jokes, Germans usually make apologies, and the apology is, of course, for not speaking in your wonderful Italian language. So I'm most grateful to Sara to help out in this situation and give a short summary at the end of each of my chapters. When the American President Woodrow Wilson developed his vision of a new world order in 1917, leading to his famous 14 points, his focus on the right of national self-determination, and that is particularly that of small nations, played an almost fundamental role. And I quote from his letters written in the late year 1917. "No nation," Wilson wrote, "should seek to extend its polity over any other nation or people, but every people should be left free to determine its own polity, its own way of development, unhindered, unthreatened, unafraid, the little along the great and powerful." Now, against the background of the First World War and the hitherto unknown number of victims, contemporaries of the year 1918 and 1919 sought to answer the question what the causes of this great catastrophe of the Great War had been. Wilson's answer pointed to the suppression of nationalities in continental Europe, and I quote again from one of his letters. "This war," Wilson wrote, "this war had its roots in the disregard of rights of small nations and of nationalities which lacked the union and the force to make good their claim to determine their own allegiances and their own forms of political life." Seen in retrospect, the First World War and the subsequent end or dissolution of the continental empires not only marked the triumph of Western democracy, it also represented the victory of the national paradigm of nation states and nationality. The combination of war efforts in the name of democratic participation and national self-determination proved to be enormously successful and suggestive. Summarizing his own war experiences and his hopes for a new post-war order, Henri Barbusse, the author of the most radical war novel, I think the most radical war novel, Le Feu, which was published in 1916, wrote, and I quote, "Humanity instead of nation. In 1789, our French revolutionaries proclaimed all French are equal, and we, the witnesses of the war, say all human beings. The equality of all necessitates rules for all men on earth." This sentence, this hope that the world war with its 17 million dead soldiers and civilians would not be in vain, in that it would lead to a new world order and a new era of peaceful internationalism, the war to end all wars, had an enormous power in 1918, and seen in retrospect, you could say that it has never lost its appeal until today. Why, and this is the question I want to answer with my paper, why was it so difficult to put this hope into practice? Why did the peace conference beginning in Paris, these 6 months that changed the world in spring 1919, why did the Paris Peace Conference not succeed in establishing an era of peace and international stability? It was the bitter disappointment and the disillusion of the hope that the First World War would be the war to end all wars that has, one could argue, accompanied the 20th century and still accompanies us today. My paper will look at some challenges and burdens of this post-war order, and it will also try to explain some of the problems of building peace after more than 4 years of warfare on an hitherto unknown level, after a totalized war. I will use the example of the Versailles Treaty in Germany, but as you will see from my paper, I'll try and contextualize that in a kind of global view, what were the global challenges of politicians meeting in Paris in spring 1919, and what was typical about the Versailles Treaty, in how far was Versailles and Paris a global moment in world history.
Okay. Allora, avete sentito? Leonard parte dal concetto di autodeterminazione, ha citato Woodrow Wilson nella sua visione dell'ordine mondiale nel 1917, secondo cui la ragione della guerra stava nella violazione dei diritti e delle ambizioni nazionali. La guerra, ci ha ricordato, è stata presentata da Wilson come il trionfo da Wilson e poi anche dai suoi critici o storici, insomma, come il trionfo della democrazia occidentale, e insieme come il trionfo del paradigma nazionale. Quali erano però, si chiede Leonard, gli elementi di questo nuovo ordine mondiale? Ricorda Barbus e la aspirazione che espresse nel 1916 riguardo al fatto che la tappa successiva dopo il successo della Rivoluzione francese sarebbe stata l'eguaglianza non solo dei cittadini francesi, ma l'uguaglianza come di tutti gli esseri umani, l'uguaglianza come principio universale. Questa espressione, questa vocazione all'internazionalismo, secondo Leonard, è l'elemento portante che caratterizza la fine del conflitto e l'idea della pace. Tuttavia, perché è così difficile applicare le idee o cercare di tradurre in un trattato di pace, in una pace, questo internazionalismo e queste idee? Perché è così difficile rispondere all'idea di una guerra che termini tutte le guerre. Questa è una citazione di H.G. Wells. Quali sono le sfide dell'ordine mondiale, i problemi di fare la pace che si pongono? A questo risponderà ora con il suo contributo.
Let me start by looking at what historians have called the Wilsonian moment, the appearance of Wilson on the global stage. The experience of totalized warfare, the enormous number of victims after the summer of 1914, one could argue made any peace settlement based on compromise almost impossible. And this important argument I want to explain to you in a little more substance. If the victims of the war, both at the military and the home front, should not be in vain, only a peace based on a maximum of political and territorial gains seemed acceptable. That was a major problem during this war. And it was this combination that fueled and radicalized the discussion on war aims during the war, and it also explained why the war could only end once one side was simply too exhausted in its military, economic and social resources to continue fighting. That was the case with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the autumn of 1918. Rising expectations characterized all states and all societies in 1918, and these rising expectations combined internal and external dimensions of politics. In contrast to earlier end-of-war constellations in modern history, after the 30 Years' War or after the Napoleonic Wars, politicians in 1919 found themselves not only under enormous pressure from the prospect of democratic elections on the basis of reformed franchises, but from a public which referred to the manifold expectations which the war had brought about. Furthermore, the use of national self-determination as a catchphrase prior to 1918, as an ideological weapon in order to win allies or to stimulate opposition from within multi-ethnic empires, Italians, Czechs, Poles, and so on, had led to many contradictory expectations after 1918. As a result, the following peace settlement was confronted with global and very different expectations which it could never meet. The period from 1919 to 1923 was essentially different from that of 1814 and 15, to say something about the difference between the Vienna Congress and the Paris Peace Conference, in that there could not be a redefinition of international order with regard to previous premises such as the balance of power. The expectations provoked and fueled by the war prevented a return to another confirmation of the pentarchy of 5 European powers under different circumstances. What contemporaries expected was no less than a new world order transcending all earlier practices of territorial rescuffling in order to guarantee state sovereignty and internal stability, as well as to keep the international system free from ideological polarizations. The almost messianic impression of Wilson's promise to combine a new world order with the idea of democratic values and national self-determination, it reflected Europe's exhaustion by 1917 and the global longing for a model of politics which would combine external security and internal stability in the name of a progressive ideal. From that perspective, the post-war era was less one of reconstruction or restoration or a return to the pre-1914 Ancien Régime of politics, but it was rather a complex and contradictory combination of construction and reconstruction. All this led to new entanglements between the spheres of society and public on the one hand and the international system on the other. Now, what were the characteristic marks of this new order? The American President Woodrow Wilson based his vision on a very suggestive analysis of the factors that, in his view, had caused the World War. For him, for Wilson, the summer of 1914 could not be an accident. Instead, it had to be interpreted as the consequence of a misguided European system of militarization, the uncontrolled development of state power, of secret diplomacy, and, very important, of autocratic empires which had suppressed according to this interpretation, the rights and interests of national minorities. The counter model which Wilson provided seemed all the more promising since it stood against the background of the exhausted variance of European liberalism, and it offered an alternative not just in terms of content, but in terms of political style. You can see from these maps, from a bird's eye perspective, how this end of empires and the development of new nation states was surely one of the most important results of the Paris Peace Conference. But to show this in some more detail, I've brought a second map with me, and this is the development of Hungary. You can see the core of Hungary left after the Treaty of Trianon, and you can see the green territories which were taken away from the former part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. You get an idea of the political embitterment caused by this kind of dismemberment. The counter model which Wilson provided was very important. It was directed against the autocratic empires, and it offered, as I said, a new way, a new content of political rule. The traditional focus on the balance of power and the sovereignty of states was shifted to that of international law, to the idea of collective security, and to the idea of a League of Nations as an international forum, coupling the ideas of democracy and national self-determination. All this formed the basis for drawing new maps. The Wilsonian moment called for what you may call a universal democratization of both societies and the international order. In that way, this Wilsonian moment could not just be applied to national minorities within continental European empires, as I showed it with regard to these maps, splitting up the autocratic multi-ethnic empires and creating new, possibly homogeneous nation states, but it was something which you could apply to the whole world. It had a global meaning in China, in Korea, as well as in India, because all these people had fought. An example of French soldiers recruited from Africa, an example of Indian soldiers at the Western Front fighting at the Somme, and quite impressive, a group of Chinese laborers recruited from mainland China working in a French munition factory. Contemporaries from all of these societies were seeking emancipation from colonial or quasi-colonial oppression. And the Wilsonian moment of 1917 corresponded to the discussion of war aims in that it became another catalyst for globally rising and contradictory expectations. In other words, the war had provoked expectations on an hitherto unknown level. You may say totalized expectations, expectations of political and social participation, if you think about mass democracy, if you think about universal franchises and the women's right to vote, but also national self-determination and greater independence and autonomy, and of ending an era of warfare by a new system of collective security. Secessionist nation building resulted from the dynamism of the First World War itself. Yes, of course, there had been secessionist nationalists before the war, and many of these irredenta nationalists had stood behind the regional conflicts on the Balkan before the summer of 1914. But I would argue this kind of nation building and nationalism was less a cause behind the outbreak of the Great European War, it was rather a consequence of it. Because you can argue that in all societies, political and military leaders used national arguments during the war in order to win allies or in order to stabilize the home front, including the promise of establishing independent nation states after the war. Besides provoking hopes of social and political participation, the war thus catalyzed competing national hopes, creating the context for an escalation of expectations. This basic factor stood behind British and American support for Thomas Mazaryk's campaigns in exile for an independent Czech state, It stood behind the German help for Ukrainian and Finnish nationalists. It stood behind the German and Austrian promises of a Polish nation-state. It also stood behind British and French promises for Arab and Palestinian independence movements, fueled by the British fear of an Ottoman-led jihad as an anti-colonial war against the British in India, appalling to the solidarity between all Muslims. For many societies, you could say for the Poles, for the Czech, for the Irish, as for the Canadians and Australians, the war marked a fundamental period of nation building, of political and cultural emancipation. For the many soldiers returning from Europe to their homes in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand or Canada, their war experiences were not only contributions to a British war in Europe, but they became part of a distinct national narrative. But for many Indians, Asians and African war veterans, their war efforts, the uncountable victims that had died among them, the proven loyalty of their war efforts were not converted into any political capital. In other words, measuring the promises of 1914 against the reality after 1918 would question the European model of political rule. Already these examples underline the potential for disappointment in the context of the peace conferences. The peace, you could argue, was overburdened with expectations from all sides, from all societies and states in Europe and beyond, in victorious and in defeated societies. Suffice it to mention here the metaphor of Vittoria Mutilata in Italy. Against this background, the example of Germany, which I'm going to present to you in a minute, is particularly interesting, because the hope for what contemporary Germans called a Wilsonian peace, in the eyes of Germans of the autumn of 1918, would mean a peace treaty based on a compromise and based on returning to a status quo of Germany as it had been before 1914. But exactly this hope would become bitterly disappointed. And my question is, why was that the case, and what was so special about the Versailles Peace Treaty?
Allora, anzitutto in questa parte della sua relazione Jörg Leonhard si chiede perché a Versailles il compromesso diventa impossibile. Anzitutto un elemento da tenere presente dice che il fatto che la guerra finisce quando i contendenti sono esausti e non riescono a continuare. Un altro elemento, che è quello che discute più a lungo, e che spiega l'impossibilità di un compromesso a Versailles, è la presenza o la creazione durante la guerra, la nascita di grandi aspettative relative alla pace, di aspettative crescenti. Perché si formano, poi si chiede, queste aspettative crescenti? Anzitutto perché l'idea di autodeterminazione è stata utilizzata durante la guerra come arma ideologica, e proprio per questo le aspettative nel senso dell'autodeterminazione, quindi le aspettative nazionali, sono molto alte. Poi passa a spiegare qual è la connessione fra l'internazionalismo di Wilson e le idee nazionali. Per Wilson i motivi che causano l'intervento degli Stati Uniti, secondo la spiegazione che ne dà il presidente Wilson, sono la reazione degli Stati Uniti al militarismo, la lotta contro la diplomazia segreta e la contrapposizione all'autocrazia in generale. E l'alternativa che Wilson e gli Stati Uniti propongono sono il diritto internazionale, la sicurezza collettiva e la società delle nazioni. E un elemento importantissimo all'interno di questo quadro è appunto l'idea di autodeterminazione, che però è un'idea che viene sostanzialmente capita, proposta in modi diversi e capita in modi diversi e pericolosi per il post, per il dopoguerra, durante il conflitto. Perché la tesi forte che propone Jörg Leonhard è che il nazionalismo è il nazionalismo degli anni fra le due guerre, sostanzialmente, e anche quello che viene alla luce al momento della stesura della pace, è in realtà una conseguenza della guerra, perché viene propagandato durante la guerra, viene propagandato ai fini della stabilizzazione nazionale, viene propagandato ai fini della formazione delle alleanze, e tutto questo non fa che aumentare le aspettative, e quindi il potenziale di delusione alla vigilia della fine del conflitto e della pace è molto, molto alto. E in particolare poi ha introdotto Leonhard il caso della Germania, dove l'idea di una pace alla Wilson, di una Wilsonian peace, una pace wilsoniana, per i tedeschi è una pace che si fonda sul compromesso. In realtà non sarà così, e adesso ci spiega il perché.
I want to start my ideas or my interpretation on the Treaty of Versailles with quite a shocking contemporary picture taken in 1919, which was taken in the very moment in which the German delegation went to the Versailles chateau to sign the treaty documents, and which was afterwards published in hundreds of thousands of French postcards. On the 28th of June 1919, the day when the German delegation arrived in the palace of Versailles to sign the peace treaty, a very particular scene took place which, like in a nutshell, reflected the symbolic and highly emotionalized meaning of this moment. First of all, the German delegation returned to that place where the German Second Empire had been founded in January 1871. Before the German delegates were brought into the room, 5 French soldiers, whose individual faces had been mutilated by the war, were placed right in front of the table on which the documents of the Versailles Treaty lay. The French Prime Minister Clemenceau shook their hands in complete silence before the German delegation was brought into the Galerie des Classes. Following the ceremony, these 5 soldiers, the so-called cinq gueules cassées, were photographed, and their portrait, as you can see it here, was published in over 400,000 postcards. Their faces seemed to represent the moral guilt of Germany behind the war. This episode, I would argue, underlined the stark contrast between the Versailles Treaty and the old tradition of European peace treaties since the 30 Years' War, of Münster and Osnabrück in 1648, as well as that of Vienna in 1815. These conferences and treaties of 1648 and 1815 had been characterized by attempts to achieve stability on the basis of relative equality, not by stigmatizing the enemy as a criminal, as had been the case during the religious wars in the 16th and early 17th century, but by treating the opponent as an equal, by acknowledging his sovereignty and by granting him the status, in the words of a famous contemporary lawyer of the early 17th century, by treating and granting him the status of a justus hostis. 1919, and this is the symbol of this, showed a quite different pattern. Yes, the war was formally over, but the treatment of the defeated prolonged the war right into the post-war period, and this was coupled with the symbolic realm of the conferences. The Paris Peace Conference was an event of enormous dimensions, and it became a laboratory of the early 20th century, a forum for developing and testing concepts of new orders. The American President Wilson, and I've mentioned that already, concentrated on his vision of collective security based on a new League of Nations. Its statute, the Statute of the League of Nations, became part of the Versailles Treaty with Germany, and it also became part of all subsequent treaties with the follower states of the Habsburg Empire, that is Austria and Hungary, and also Bulgaria. The League of Nations was formed by the Allied powers, by some associated states and neutral countries. However, and that's very important, all the defeated powers were excluded. And furthermore, Wilson did not succeed to ratify the treaty in the US Senate in 1920, so that the US, may be the most important political and economic actor in Paris in spring 1919, that the United States herself never became a member of the League. That was a structural defeat. Very soon, the complex negotiations starting in Paris in spring 1919 showed that the former war allies had very different interests. The French perspective, represented by Prime Minister Clemenceau, was dominated by the idea of gaining security against Germany after the experience of two traumatic wars, that of 1870-71 and that of 1914 to 1918. Any resurgence of Germany in French eyes was to be prevented, politically, economically, and militarily. Hence, the Rhine as a natural frontier played an important role, but also the future alliances with the new nation states in Central and Eastern Europe, especially the Little Entente with Poland and Czechoslovakia. But there were also attempts at dismembering Germany by supporting secessionist movements in the Rhineland, in a way following the older model of the Confederation of the Rhine during the Napoleonic period. Demanding huge reparations from Germany, the financial extent of which was not defined by the treaty, were another French instrument in that context. On the one hand, the financial reparations were meant to compensate for the enormous costs of rebuilding large parts of northern France and of paying the enormous pensions of war veterans, of invalids, of widows and orphans. But in fact, a large part of the money was also used in order to pay back war credits which the US had offered France and Britain during the war. And the reparations should also serve as an instrument to contain Germany's economic power. The position of Great Britain vis-à-vis Germany was quite different. The British Prime Minister David Lloyd George focused on what may be called an imperial logic of Britain in a post-war period. Any global influence of Germany and her naval fleet, so much feared before 1914, was to be minimized. Hence, the taking over of former German colonies in Africa and Asia by Britain and France, and the end of a global German maritime and trade network were far more important for Britain than the political and territorial dismemberment of the German state or its economic weakening. Furthermore, the strong anti-Bolshevism of the British government influenced the British position in Paris. Following the October Revolution and the Russian Civil War, the British political leaders feared a Bolshevik infection of workers in the British industrial centers, and in order to contain the danger of a revolutionary spread over, Germany had, in British eyes, had to remain a stable power in Central Europe, where two former empires were in dissolution. With over 440 articles in 15 parts and numerous appendices, the Versailles Treaty between the Allied powers and Germany was one of the most complicated and complex peace treaties in world history. The regulations meant that Germany lost over 70,000 square kilometers of territory with over 7.3 million inhabitants. I've brought a contemporary photograph showing Germans expelled from Alsace near Breisach, which is close to my home university Freiburg. They were either open to opt to stay in France, but then also to apply for French state citizenship or to leave the country. And this is a contemporary photograph showing thousands of Germans being expelled from Alsace and moving to Freiburg and the Freiburg region. In addition, the German military was reduced to 100,000 men, and a small defensive fleet and no tanks and airplanes were allowed. Different zones and bridgeheads along the Rhine were demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops. And in some areas, like for instance in Schleswig, plebiscites were held in 1920-21, or at least planned. And this is a poster from one of the campaigns asking people, of course, to vote for Schleswig to stay German. All this had an important meaning for German interior politics. But apart from these regulations, it was the penal provisions of the treaty and the required handing over of the former Emperor William II and other members of the German political and military elite as war criminals which most embittered the German public. And I think this part of the Versailles Treaty, the treatment of William II, the talk about war criminals, was much more important than the number of railroads, locomotives and wagons handed over to the French. These demands, the treatment of the former elite as war criminals, these demands as well as the reparations were justified by referring to Germany's particular responsibility for the outbreak of the war in Article 231 of the treaty. And this article 231, would become the very object, I think the most important object of all future revisionist politics. Yet, and this is my interpretation of the Versailles Treaty, yet in comparison with the regulations of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between the German Empire and Russia, concluded in March 1918, the supposed harshness of the Versailles Treaty becomes very relative. Contrary to the perception of the Versailles Treaty in the German public, the treaty did not represent a dictated peace based on extortion and meant to destroy once and for all Germany as a continental European power. The peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk had indeed reduced the Russian Empire to a Russian core territory, and in spring 1918 the former Tsarist Empire lost nearly all territories it had gained in the process of territorial extension since the reign of Peter the Great, fostering numerous secessions and building of new nation-states in Eastern Europe. In contrast, the Versailles Treaty did not end the status of Germany as a continental power. Given the erosion and the collapse of both the Tsarist and the Habsburg Empire, one can rather argue that Germany's relative position in Central and Eastern Europe was maybe even stronger before 1914, especially given the many new, small and often fragile nation-states around her. The almost classical constellation of three competing powers of the German, the Tsarist and the Habsburg Empire in Central and Eastern Europe had been replaced by a new order in which the German position, despite the symbolic meaning of territorial losses and the corridor of Danzig, could be very decisive in the future. From that perspective, the difference between the end of the war in 1918 and the end of the Second World War in 1945 is, I think, very evident. The First World War did not end with an unconditional surrender, as did the May of 1945 brought about unconditional surrender to end Nazi Germany. This option, the option of an unconditional surrender, had been discussed between the military commanders of the Allies in autumn 1918, but had eventually been rejected because of the exhaustion of British and French troops who were not prepared to be engaged in what was feared to be a people's war in the German mainland. The Versailles Treaty allowed Germany her resources to develop a revisionist foreign policy. This is the main difference between the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War. But the price which the Allies paid was very high, because the war ended with an armistice, not with any Allied soldier on German soil, and this is the fact that allowed many Germans not to believe in the defeat, but to look for other explanations, especially the step-in-the-back myth. I'll come back to that in a minute. It made it very difficult for many Germans to understand and to accept the defeat, given the fact that no Allied soldier stood on German soil in November 1918. Yet at the same time, the Versailles Treaty directly contributed to the crisis of the young Weimar Republic, and this is maybe the factor most important if you look at the development in the 1920s and 30s. Most Germans regarded the Versailles Treaty as unfair, if not traumatic. But the treaty also, and this is the main argument here, it also disqualified the Western model of democracy, which the German military and political elite had introduced by the so-called October reforms of 1918, thereby making the constitutional monarchy a parliamentarian monarchy, only as a precondition, as a basis to fulfill Wilson's demands in his 14 points, and thereby to prepare the way to a mild Wilsonian peace. And this Wilsonian ideal was, of course, also, in a way, further destroyed or eroded by the fact that the Austrians were not allowed the right of self-determination. There was, as you all know, no plebiscite in Austria to fuse Austria and Germany after 1918. The German public, who in March 1918 and after the victory in the East had been convinced that a further victory in the Western Front was imminent before the weight of the American troops could change the situation, was in no way prepared for the defeat of November 1918. When its hope for a Wilsonian peace confirming the status quo of Germany was disappointed, the treaty's results were used by all those who believed that Germany had been betrayed by her enemies, both from within and from outside. And this is what you can see on this poster. This is the famous step-in-the-back myth, the idea that the German soldier was not defeated by the Allied, but by a red Bolshevik-like person coming from the eroding German home front. The traumatizing complex of Versailles and the subsequent fulfillment policy was coupled with the step-in-the-back myth, the very suggestive idea that the German military had not been defeated by the Allies but by the radical left defeatists from the crumbling home front. The traitors of November 1918 therefore became the prime targets of radical groups who looked for those apparently responsible for defeat, and the Republic and the Treaty of Versailles. And this is what bridges the gap between 1918 and 1933. This is a poster from the NSDAP, in a way looking at the war victim and trying to instrumentalize the war victim and appealing to the generation of 1914. The result, and this is what I want to say as a summary of this interpretation, the result of this complex of the Versailles Treaty and the step-in-the-back myth was a prolongation of inner polarization and violence in post-war Germany.
Allora, ho cominciato con una foto che deve mostrare il valore simbolico, la foto dei mutilati, che rappresenta la condanna morale della Germania che veniva messa in luce e sottolineata durante la conferenza di Versailles. Il punto che emerge all'inizio di questo paragrafo è che Versailles fu una pace che che fu negoziata in maniera, anzi non fu negoziata, fu per questo radicalmente diversa dalle paci precedenti. La foto dimostra la stigmatizzazione del nemico che aveva caratterizzato la stesura del trattato di pace, un nemico che nelle paci precedenti, dal trattato di Westfalia dal 1648 fino al congresso di Vienna si fondava su un atteggiamento cooperativo, sull'idea del Justus Hostis. Invece a Versailles il nemico è moralmente deprecabile. Così moralmente deprecabile che gli sconfitti vengono esclusi dal sistema del futuro, dalla società delle nazioni, da cui peraltro, ricordava ancora Leonard, si autoescludono anche quelli che l'avevano proposto, cioè gli Stati Uniti. Poi Leonard è passato a sottolineare quali fossero i diversi interessi dei partecipanti alla conferenza della pace: la Francia di Clemenceau, che voleva la punizione della Germania, che voleva prevenire il risorgere della potenza tedesca che tanto male aveva fatto in altre occasioni, voleva insomma contenere la Germania e voleva imporre delle riparazioni che pagassero i danni di guerra e anche i costi della guerra. Mentre invece la Gran Bretagna aveva una visione diversa e voleva annullare sostanzialmente la dimensione globale, la proiezione globale della Germania, l'impero coloniale, la marina, e aveva un atteggiamento fortemente antibolscevico, tanto che vedeva nella Germania una possibile colonna, barriera nei confronti dell'espansionismo bolscevico. Fra gli elementi, e poi Leonard è passato a descrivere le clausole sostanzialmente, anche se brevemente, del trattato, quanto a perdite territoriali, di popolazione, la demilitarizzazione, e soprattutto ha sottolineato come nell'opinione pubblica tedesca sia stata la punizione dell'imperatore, delle elite politiche dell'imperatore Guglielmo II e la sua stigmatizzazione dell'elite e dell'imperatore come criminali di guerra a causare un effetto psicologico molto forte. Il famoso articolo 231 del Trattato di Versailles, che attribuisce la responsabilità della guerra alla Germania, era un punto che fu discusso e che avrebbe avuto a lungo sarebbe stato discusso a lungo. La parte come dire, più nuova e molto forte dell'argomento di Jörn Leonhard in questa sua esposizione, in questo suo paragrafo, riguarda il confronto fra il Trattato di Versailles e il trattato che la Germania a sua volta aveva imposto, diciamo aveva negoziato, ma la Russia bolscevica, il trattato di Brest-Litovsk, che questo sì aveva distrutto l'impero zarista e ne aveva compromesso la natura come impero, mentre invece Versailles no, e anzi, notava Leonhard, al di là delle perdite territoriali di popolazione e le riparazioni, la posizione tedesca, visto che all'interno, nella Mitteleuropa, di imperi non ce ne sono poi più altri, la posizione tedesca finisce dal punto di vista strategico con l'essere quasi migliore di prima. Tanto più il Trattato di Versailles non è, come poi sarebbe stato alla fine della Seconda Guerra Mondiale, un'imposizione, non deriva dall'imposizione di una resa senza condizioni. Quindi resta possibile la ricostruzione dell'impero. Questo però fa anche sì, e questo è l'ultimo punto sostanzialmente, fa anche sì che per la popolazione tedesca sia difficile capire la disfatta. Non c'è una resa totale, non c'è l'occupazione. Di fatto quello che succede con il trattato, con un trattato severo che viene percepito come un diktat, come un'imposizione, finisce con lo squalificare le modifiche costituzionali che erano state previste con la Repubblica di Weimar e con la Costituzione di Weimar, proprio per presentarsi in modo, come dire, affine alle idee wilsoniane in previsione della pace. E questo, secondo Leonard, è un elemento importante per capire cosa viene dopo e per capire soprattutto l'idea del tradimento che verrà, che diventerà fondamentale, una fondamentale arma di propaganda politica contro il nemico interno negli anni fra le due guerre, con il mito della pugnalata dietro la schiena, e se non c'è stata resa senza condizioni, se non c'è stata occupazione, il motivo per cui la Germania viene punita è per l'incapacità sostanzialmente delle nuove elite socialiste, io dico anche ebraiche, anche se lui non l'ha detto, i traditori del 1919 che sono identificati con la Repubblica di Weimar.
I would like to finish my paper by looking from a bird's eye perspective at what I call the ambivalence of the post-war order, and I want to differentiate 8 factors that explain the difficulties, the burden, and ultimately also, I think, contribute to the explanation of the failure of this post-war order. My first point: the implementation of the new post-war order after 1918 depended on a very complicated cooperation between the American president, European politicians, and diplomatic elites, which all came to Paris with their very own traditional views on key concepts such as security, sovereignty, national interest, and with their very own particular experiences of the war and the lessons they had derived from it. As a result, the famous Wilsonian moment of 1917-18 became very soon compromised and also very soon overshadowed by premises such as the French obsession with security against Germany, or the strong anti-Bolshevist position of Wilson himself or the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Against this background, the combination of the 5 treaties rather overshadowed the complexity of the new reality which the treaties never fully represented. The post-war settlement was hence problematic from the beginning because it was based on the illusion of a new order and a new narrative of international order being decided upon in Paris. In fact, fundamental developments during and immediately after the war had already led to new realities in a number of conflict zones. The tri-national kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes was already in existence and only sought international recognition, whereas in the Near East, effective boundaries of zones of interest had already been defined by Britain and France during the war on the basis of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. All this happened outside the Paris Peace Conference. Contrary to the idea of a break from the past and contradicting the idea of national self-determination, the colonial empires of France and Britain were not reduced, but they expanded. In a way, they reached their territorial peak after 1918, whereas the former Ottoman Empire became integrated into the existing empires. Thus, the end of the war marked a peak moment in the history of European imperialism and a difficult beginning of decolonization, as the events in India, the Amritsar massacre, proved in April 1919. In India, as well as in Africa, and foremost in the Near East, hopes that the Wilsonian model would be applied to colonies were immediately disappointed. My second point: if there was a break with the past after 1918, it was the end of monarchical empires on the European continent. It was not the end of imperialism or the concept of empire as such. They, continued in new forms even after the end of formal empires. In sharp contrast to the settlement of 1814-15, which brought about a reconfiguration and reformulation of the monarchical principle, ranging from parliamentary over constitutional to autocratic variations, the watershed of 1919 to 1923 separated the idea of empire from that of monarchy. After 1923, there was no major monarchy left on the European continent east of the Rhine and in the whole Eurasian sphere, since in China the monarchy had already been abolished in 1911, and in Turkey the Sultanate was no more than a symbolic bridge between the imperial past and the Turkish Republic, founded in 1923 after the successful revision of the Treaty of Sèvres. If in 1814-15 monarchy had been regarded as the prime instrument in order to achieve internal security and external stability, then this belief was basically delegitimized and destroyed during and by the First World War. My third point. The creation of new nation states with particular historical legitimacies could take the form of an imperial reconstruction, as in the case of Poland. But in fact, this had less to do with a peace settlement in Paris, but rather with the war of liberation of the Poles started under Pilsudski in the shadow of the Great War. This corresponded to earlier models of nation building through wars of liberation, amalgamating thereby elements of civil war and state wars against a foreign power which was perceived as an imperial oppressor. Here, as in the case of Ireland in 1916, the legacy of 19th century premises of nation building through war was decisive. What the Paris peace settlement established was a very odd mixture and a problematic balance between rump states from the former centers of empires, Austria and Hungary, as well as the Turkish Republic, and new states in the former peripheries of empires, be it nation states like Finland or the Baltic states, or new creations of bi- and tri-national states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. What was important, however, was that for all of these new creations, Paris, the Paris settlement, served as no essentially positive element of the national narratives. Neither Polish nor Irish narratives of their respective nation-state building referred to the Paris treaties in order to gain legitimacy. The Paris Treaty only generated narratives in a negative sense for Germans, for Austrians, and Hungarians in particular. For these, the negative reference fueled aggressive revisionisms or led, as in the case of China and India, to alternative ideologies. In all of these cases, the Wilsonian model had soon lost its appeal for democratic politics and a democratization of the international system. My fourth point. The post-war reconstruction proved to be problematic and unstable because of its essentially contradictory character. This could be observed on different levels. Defining and applying the concept of national self-determination depended on political and ideological premises, from the French obsession with national security to the anti-Bolshevik reflex of many European politicians. National self-determination was accepted and welcome in order to confirm secessionist nation building in the periphery of former continental empires, but as I said, the German Austrians were prevented from joining the German nation-state despite their obvious determination. There also developed a number of other contradictions in practice. Traditional connotations of state sovereignty and national interest stood against the new idea of collective security. Bilateralism continued despite the ideal of collective security and multilateralism. The most fundamental contradiction, I think, developed around the concept of national self-determination itself, because it was coupled with the historically or racially defined maturity of peoples, and it was not applied to colonial contexts. When introduced by Wilson, this seemed to denote an ideal of simple and clear solutions following John Stuart Mill's premise that free institutions were impossible to imagine in a state with multiple nationalities. But when applied to practice, it rather demonstrated the complex realities of often overlapping or competing identities, especially in borderlands and large parts of Eastern and Southeastern Europe after 1919. They became characterized by features of borderlands. Only a few plebiscites were in the end held in Upper Silesia and in Schleswig, but not, for instance, in Teschen, where the situation was so complicated that even experts did not know how to realize a plebiscite. Very often, the plebiscite presupposed a particular knowledge of national belonging which did not exist in practice, and as a result, final decisions were in most cases made by commissions and in consultation with representatives who often had no democratic legitimacy at all. This further weakened the post-war settlement's legitimacy. My fifth point. The triumphant ideal of the nation-state, corresponding to the negative narrative of autocratic empires doomed to failure, generated its own problems and costs. Adhering to the model of ethnically homogeneous nation-states led to the practice of demixing multi-ethnic territories. The dimensions of ethnic violence in the name of this principle had become obvious already well before 1914 and in particular during the Balkan Wars of 1912-13. But the experience of the World War added to this the dimension of the state war, its infrastructures and its means of violence, the vocabularies of necessity, mobilization and loyalty. The consequences became clear already in the Armenian genocide, which continued well after 1918, but also in the mass expulsions and ethnic violence between Greeks and Turks after 1919. There was a clear continuity from pre-war to war and post-war regarding the space for violent social and demographic engineering in the name of ethnically homogeneous nation-states. In fact, one could rather argue that from this perspective, the war did not begin in 1914 and ended in 1918, but it lasted from 1908 to 1923, at least in the southeastern part of Germany. In this room, in this space, the boundaries between state war, civil war, and ethnic warfare became very permeable. Sixth point. The post-war settlement's legitimacy was further weakened by the fact that various actors either withdrew from the political forum of the international system, as in the case of the United States, despite their economic and monetary presence in Europe, or were excluded from the system already in 1919, as in the case of Germany and the Soviet Union. Both were forced to find other levels of overcoming their international isolation. And in that way, the Treaty of Rapallo of 1922 underlined the continuity of bilateral diplomacy and its importance over collective security, as, one should add, did the Treaty of Locarno. The case of the Soviet Union was particular in another perspective as well, because despite Lenin's rhetoric of national self-determination, the political practice of the interwar period revealed the very imperial practice of a multi-ethnic state in which autonomy was the exception and not the rule. Seventh point. Both the war and the Wilsonian moment had provoked, as I said in the beginning, globally rising expectations of what a peace settlement had to achieve. The hitherto unknown number of war victims which had to be legitimized through the results of the peace, ever radicalizing war aims, the ideal of a new international order which would make future wars impossible, as well as the new mass markets of public deliberations and the new relation between internationalism and domestic politics, all these elements contributed to a massive disillusion and disappointment. Turning away from the new international order, which seemed to have lost its legitimacy very soon, paved the way to multiple revisionisms. And in turn, they could be easily instrumentalized in domestic conflicts. In that way, foreign political revisionism provided the munition for political conflicts and ideological polarization in post-war societies. That was the case not only, and I want to really underline this, This was the case not only in Germany or Hungary, but also in Italy. Here, the Vittoria Mutilata corresponded well to the various step-in-the-back myths and narratives of conspiracy or treachery, which would further weaken the reputation of post-war liberal political regimes. For the defeated Germans, the economic and monetary legacy of the peace settlement linked any domestic political conflict easily to the trauma of Versailles. This was what poisoned German political culture and prevented the evolution of a positive republican narrative after 1918. In a global perspective, a similar disappointment was obvious in China, where protests against Western and Japanese imperialism led to the 4th of May movement and to a national revolution. It was obvious in India or in the Arab world, where promised independence turned into the realities of mandates, in which French and British colonial rule was soon established. Only Turkey succeeded in overcoming the cage of the Treaty of Sèvres by violence. After 1923 and the establishment of a Turkish republic, it was the only example of what you may call a saturated power which did not follow any more revisionist aims. Turkey remained neutral in the Second World War. And this constellation also explains why the formal end of the war on the 11th day of November 1918 did not mean the end of violence. If we follow the aura of the 11th hour of the 11th day in the 11th month of 1918, we focus on the end of war between states in Western Europe, while other wars continued or were about to start. In Ireland and Poland, where new nation states emerged in civil war or national war. In Eastern Europe as a whole, where the state war had already ended in 1917 and transcended into a civil war, time and again overlapping with ethnic conflicts that would continue into the early 1920s. But it was also the case in the Near and Middle East, in India, in Asia, and in many parts of Northern Africa. In other words, the formal end of the war gave way to a very broad spectrum of new spaces of violence on a global level, and all this transcends our chronological compartment of 1914 to 1918. My last point. A last contradiction of the settlement of Paris can be seen in the tension between the politics and the economics of the treaty system. It was clear for many critical observers of the Paris Peace Conference, as John Maynard Keynes' contemporary interpretation indicated. In his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, he argued that the reparations would not only burden the international economic recovery, but would also contribute to the social instability of Germany. If you sum all this up, there developed an amalgam of constructions and deconstructions after the First World War, in which the domestic and the international sphere of politics became ever more entangled. The idea of internationalization of political deliberation in the League of Nations proved to be partly successful. Yes, there now existed a public forum, although without executive power, to implement collective security, as Japan's aggression against Manchuria was to demonstrate in 1932. But as the examples of the administration of the Free City of Danzig or the Saarland and the mandatories proved, the role of the League of Nations could be very constructive, and in contrast to the pre-war period, there now existed a range of institutions that allowed public and international focus on minorities, the International Court of Justice in Den Haag or the International Labour Office. Nevertheless, the main outcome of the peace settlement was a dual dissolution, both in the international system and within post-war societies. And Wilson himself admitted, and I quote, "When I gave utterance to those words that all nations had a right to self-determination, I said them without the knowledge that nationalities existed which are coming to us day after day. You do not know and cannot appreciate the anxieties that I have experienced as a result of many millions of people having their hopes raised by what I said." The post-war period was characterized by elements of continuity and discontinuity. there had been no simple antagonism between empires and nation states before 1914, but rather a complex combination between nationalizing empires and imperializing nation states. And after the formal end of the war, there was no simple antagonism between the end of bad empires and the triumph of good nation states. The end of autocratic and monarchical systems and the breaking up of multi-ethnical continental empires were followed by the creation of new nation states, which were often neither democratic nor stable, and which sought classical alliances instead of relying on collective security. If there was a triumph of the model of a homogeneous nation state, it was more and more dissociated from the democratic principle in practice, and it came with the enormous costs of mass expulsions and ethnic violence, demonstrating the potential of destructive utopias. This triumph of the nation state did not replace the idea of empire, it rather coexisted with continuities of old empires in new formats, as in the Soviet Union and to a certain degree in Turkey as well. And it also went together with the maximum expansion of the colonial empires of France and Britain, with new imperial aspirations as in the case of Japan and the United States. And finally, the tradition of imperializing nation states certainly resurfaced again during the interwar years, but now in a very radicalized form, with revisionism turning into new and radical aspirations for empire building in Germany, but also in Italy. Thank you very much.
Bene, allora traduco per quelli che sono rimasti indietro i punti finali, gli 8 punti finali del contributo di Jörn Leonhard riguardo all'ambivalenza dell'ordine del dopoguerra. Anzitutto il primo punto è che i concetti wilsoniani non tornano tutti. In particolare ha citato il fatto che invece che il successo dell'autodeterminazione negli imperi coloniali in particolare si ebbe l'espansione, l'ampliamento degli imperi. In secondo luogo, un secondo punto che caratterizzò l'ordine del dopoguerra fu la separazione fra l'idea di impero e l'idea di monarchia. Sostanzialmente le monarchie non erano più dei buoni strumenti per aiutare la pace, per garantire la stabilità. Il terzo punto che comparvero nel dopoguerra, comparve l'idea delle guerre di liberazione contro l'oppressione imperiale. E l'esempio europeo citato da Leonhard è l'esempio polacco di Piłsudski. Una cosa che ha sottolineato importante è che i trattati di pace non generarono narrative positive, ma soltanto negative, cioè il trattato di pace non fu considerato come un successo da nessuno sostanzialmente. E quarto punto, che la ricostruzione si svolse in un quadro instabile, dove l'idea del multilateralismo non riuscì a garantire la stabilità, e dove il principio di nazionalità venne applicato in maniera molto selettiva all'interno di questo quadro multilaterale di riferimento, che sostanzialmente era il quadro previsto all'interno della Società delle Nazioni, per cui ad esempio soltanto pochi plebisciti furono organizzati per cercare di dare applicazione all'idea dell'autodeterminazione dei popoli. Quanto al trionfo del principio nazionale, siamo al quinto punto. Il principio nazionale trionfò spesso in connessione con la violenza, E quindi finì, il successo della nazionalità finì con l'essere identificato con la violenza etnica a partire dal genocidio, per passare attraverso alle espulsioni, ai trasferimenti di popolazione. E notava Leonard che esiste, qui ha inserito il discorso sulla periodizzazione della prima guerra mondiale, che sta cambiando, che ci sono molti elementi che ci suggeriscono che dovremmo cambiare la nostra idea di guerra e estenderla a prima e a dopo. Ci sono tantissimi elementi di continuità, in particolare per quanto riguarda le idee di ingegneria, i progetti di ingegneria etnica che avvengono con forti elementi di violenza anche alla fine del conflitto. Poi, sesto punto che caratterizza l'ordine del dopoguerra e la sua ambivalenza, il fatto che la legittimità dell'ordine internazionale, qui viene ripreso un concetto più classico, è minata dall'assenza delle grandi potenze, sostanzialmente di quasi tutte le grandi potenze, sia gli Stati Uniti, sia la Germania, sia la Russia bolscevica e poi Unione Sovietica, che non partecipano alla rimodulazione a livello internazionale dell'ordine mondiale, cioè non partecipano alla Società delle Nazioni. Settimo punto riguarda i revisionismi. I revisionismi, dice Leonard, sono strumenti di destabilizzazione e indeboliscono il regime del dopoguerra, dove sostanzialmente c'è un solo paese che, peraltro non immediatamente, ma dopo un'altra guerra conclusasi nel 1923, si può dire soddisfatto, cioè la Turchia. Dalle altre parti, e non solo in Ungheria e non solo in Germania, ma anche in Italia, in realtà noi lo sappiamo bene, l'idea della vittoria mutilata è un motore fortissimo di destabilizzazione. La guerra peraltro continua a lungo dappertutto, tranne che sul fronte occidentale, che è quello che di solito si studia. Ottavo punto è il punto relativo alla tensione fra politica e economia, che forse è il punto che è toccato anche più spesso, perché Keynes è in tutte le narrazioni del dopoguerra e della critica all'ordine del dopoguerra. Gli elementi su cui conclude il suo intervento Leonard sono gli elementi relativi al rapporto fra internazionalizzazione e Stato nazionale. E il punto che mi pare importante sottolineare è in particolare che l'idea di sicurezza collettiva non prende piede, perché gli esempi anche di successo che ci sono e che ha citato non sono numerosissimi e non sono considerati e non entrano nelle narrative positive di cui parlava prima. Mentre invece il modello, che è il modello vincente che esce dal conflitto, l'ordine post-conflitto, è il modello dello Stato nazionale, che però non è affatto associato con la fine della violenza, anzi il contrario. Quindi l'eredità, diciamo, della guerra è un'eredità connotata di questo elemento violento. Bene. Grazie a tutti. Ringrazio molto, per fortuna non devo tradurre, perché lui l'italiano lo capisce benissimo, anche se Quindi, anche se non lo parla, e fa bene, perché si fa bene a parlare nelle lingue che si conoscono meglio, no? In quelle che si conoscono un pochino meno. E allora, a questo punto io introdurrei direttamente e aprirei al pubblico per le domande, gli elementi che ci ha dato anche nuovi di interpretazione. Questo contributo di Jörn Leonhard sono veramente molto rilevanti, e apro al pubblico, o più o meno informato, e do la parola anzitutto a Simone Bellezza, che vedo già il microfono.
Grazie. Parlo in italiano, mi è stato detto di parlare in italiano, al massimo cerco di parlare lentamente, non troppo velocemente. Innanzitutto volevo ringraziarla per questa conferenza veramente interessante, sono particolarmente d'accordo con i punti finali, gli 8 punti finali che mi sono sembrati veramente interessanti, forse anche degni di ulteriore discussione e riflessione. Ho una domanda e forse una critica. La domanda è, guardando al fatto che la prima guerra mondiale è essenzialmente iniziata nei Balcani, ci sono le guerre balcaniche, poi c'è ovviamente l'attentato a Sarajevo, eccetera, eccetera, e guardando anche ai cambiamenti di confini che ci sono stati, che sono essenzialmente nell'area dell'Europa centro-orientale e nel Medio Oriente, mi verrebbe da dire, si può dire, la domanda è un po' provocatoria, si può dire che la prima guerra mondiale è una guerra che viene combattuta per la supremazia in quello che io chiamerei il Medio Oriente mondiale, cioè il Medio Oriente europeo, come dice Luis Namier, cioè l'Europa centro-orientale e il Medio Oriente, quello che conosciamo tutti del Medio Oriente asiatico, anche se uno pensa al fatto che prima della prima guerra mondiale la Germania stava aumentando la sua influenza sull'impero turco per le risorse, anche per il gas, no? Allora mi sembra che la vera linea di confronto fra gli imperi centrali, soprattutto la Germania, e Inghilterra e Francia, è quella lì, fra l'Europa orientale, dove in effetti dopo la seconda guerra mondiale Francia e Gran Bretagna hanno più influenza di quanto non ne avessero prima, e il Medio Oriente. La critica, che non so se sia proprio una critica, perché non sono sono un esperto, ma non proprio di quella cosa in particolare, ma che formulerò come una critica per essere più chiaro, è invece sul confronto, che ho trovato in realtà interessantissimo, fra la pace di Versailles e la pace di Brest-Litovsk. Nel senso che se uno guarda la pace di Brest-Litovsk, non è una pace fatta per distruggere l'impero russo. L'impero russo è già caduto da un sacco di tempo. La pace di sì, l'impero russo è già caduto, lo zar non c'è già più, e lì c'è il potere bolscevico. Quella è una pace che viene fatta tra due poteri, la Germania da una parte essenzialmente e dall'altra la Russia di Lenin, che hanno una necessità disperata di arrivare a una pace tra loro due per concentrarsi, per riorganizzare le forze e concentrarsi su un altro fronte, che è per Lenin quello della guerra civile e per la Germania quello della guerra contro la Francia, la Gran Bretagna, l'Italia e gli alleati. Quindi non so se questa cosa di vedere Brest-Litovsk come in realtà è una pace tattica per entrambi, per riorganizzarsi.
Bene, altre domande?
Abbiamo scoperto che abbiamo avuto la concorrenza di Luciano Canfora, che parla in aula 005 con 3.500 persone, perché chi va in televisione naturalmente, ancora a maggior ragione gli irriducibili sono irriducibili e apparentemente incontentabili. Se volete continuiamo a organizzare un altro ciclo, no, sto scherzando. No, volevo far osservare anche su Brest, però è interessante il confronto che fa Jörn. Volevo far osservare questa cosa, chiederti un commento su questo. Alla fine della prima guerra mondiale cambiano i confini in un modo spaventoso in tutta Europa, ma per la verità anche fuori dall'Europa. Alla fine della seconda guerra mondiale, a parte diciamo la Polonia, i confini non cambiano granché, piccoli cambiamenti, ma se li confrontiamo con il 18-19, cioè questo E l'idea che invece noi abbiamo spesso è che la seconda guerra mondiale rappresenti veramente una svolta nella storia del mondo, con le superpotenze, con la guerra fredda. E invece la prima guerra mondiale, in fondo, sì, nascono gli stati nazionali, ma cioè un tuo commento su questo confronto possibile che si può fare se guardiamo la carta politica dell'Europa dopo il 18 e dopo il 45. Grazie.
I'll start. Both questions are really interesting, and three questions and at least one comment. Yes, many maps are changed, and of course, to start with, that has to do with the erosion of multi-ethnic empires. If you read through Wilson and the progressive liberals coming from the States to Europe, you can see that this is maybe the dominant, their dominant explanation for them with regard to the summer of 1914. Empires as prisons of free people, of young people, old empires and young peoples, and you have to free them. And if you do that, you have to draw maps. Now, after 1945, there aren't that many multinational empires that erode. That I think is a kind of basic structural difference. But there is, of course, another difference as well, and that has to do with, you may say, the learning curve after 1918. The politicians in Paris hoped that it would be possible to prevent a future war by drawing new maps. I mean, there are cohorts of specialists, geographers, international lawyers, ethnographs brought to Paris as, you may say, as the champions of knowledge, of contemporary knowledge. And the idea was, if we put that into practice, then there will be no more war. Hence, the demixing of multi-ethnic empires was regarded as the best way to achieve a lasting peace. Now, the big problem of this is, of course, and this refers to your question about the Middle and Near East as well, that most of the new states were not homogeneous nation states, but were, in the famous word of Theodor Schieder, a German historian, were Nationalitätenstaaten, states of nationalities. And the big problem is that the ethnic and national minorities are not protected by the League of Nations. Wilson had the idea that it would be very, very necessary to install rules of how to protect national minorities in these new states, but that was not realized. And in all of these states, just think about the Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia, the existence of these minorities in a way radicalized a kind of irredenta nationalism, which was, we could say, one of the reasons why the shots of Sarajevo were shot on the morning of 28th of June 1914. But this problem was not solved, but rather multiplied in the European world, but also to an extent outside Europe. Coming to your question, I think there is a lot of debate about that right at the moment, and that has to do with the debate, I'm sure you have come across that, between historians and the Turkish government, and the question of the involvement of the German government in the Armenian genocide. And my Berlin colleague Herfried Münkler has written a whole chapter on the importance of this coalition between Berlin and Istanbul for the meaning of the global war. And there are different schools. For my colleague Gerd Grummeich, the First World War is essentially a war between France and Germany. And there are many East European historians who would argue, no, it is essentially a war between Russia and Germany. My point is, if we really want to understand this war as a global war, we have to break into these compartments. I mean, the part of my book which was most interesting for me was to see what happens in Africa, in Asia, or in other regions of the world where you cannot, in a way, apply the ideal of a European war to the realities, to the expectations, and to the experiences. And there are millions of veterans returning to these countries as well. So I think it's really difficult to define this world war, this global war, from the perspective from the perspective of a focus on the Western Front. If you look at 2014, you can see that a lot of understanding of the First World War is still dominated by looking at Britain, France, Germany, and maybe a little bit of Russia. But it totally ignores what was going on, for instance, in Japan, in China, and in other parts of the world. And that brings me to your critical question about Brest-Litovsk. No, I don't think that this is just a tactical piece. If you read carefully the diaries and letters of the German delegates, you get an idea that this is much more. It's an idea about, and I'm really careful to use the word, but it anticipates a lot of Lebensraum ideology. It's not the same Lebensraum ideology as that of Hitler, but it's not meant tactically. If you look at the history of Ober-Ost, Ludendorff's military state established after the breakthrough in 1915, 1916 against Russia, this is the idea of a grand military empire in Eastern Europe which will solve all strategic and not tactical problems of Germany. And that is to say, the problem of raw materials, the problem of oil, and the problem of the home front, the main problem of the home front, and that is hunger. The answer that is in a way coupled with Brest-Litovsk is to feed the home front in order to win this war. This is not just tactical. This is well beyond. It involves a lot of plans how to develop this area. And it's not an accident that a lot of young officers who have been to Brest-Litovsk and played a very important role in, so to say, cultivating this special war in the East would play an important role in the 1920s and early 1930s. The aim of Brest-Litovsk is not just to gain a breathing space in order to win in the West. The diaries of many military commanders speak a different language in that regard. I think these were the three questions.
Volete la traduzione? Sì? Sì? No? Qualcosa, ok. Allora, ho risposto per prima alla terza domanda, i confini. Alla questione dei confini che cambiano di più dopo la prima guerra mondiale che dopo la seconda, e la motivazione secondo Jörg Leonhard è che la prima guerra mondiale viene presentata come questione di liberazione dei popoli e quindi stabilire dei confini per dare concretezza a questa idea di liberazione è una parte di questa storia. E per quanto riguarda la modifica dei confini e ciò che accade dopo la seconda guerra mondiale, si tratta in fondo del fatto che dopo la seconda guerra mondiale è stata imparata la lezione di Versailles, cioè che stabilire questi confini è stato più controproducente che altro. E poi ha fatto riferimento al fatto che le minoranze non erano protette direttamente. No, io su questo, siccome non sono d'accordo, faccio fatica a tradurlo, però faccio lo stesso. Le minoranze non erano protette dalla società delle nazioni, non fortemente protette. Era stata criticata molto la società delle nazioni per il regime di protezione delle minoranze che era associato a lei, e il problema viene moltiplicato, non è solo un problema europeo, ma viene moltiplicato anche fuori dall'Europa. Quanto alla domanda sulla guerra per il Medio Oriente mondiale, Jörn Leonhard dice che sì, ci sono scuole diverse di pensiero, quelli che ritengono che la prima guerra mondiale fosse questione fra Francia e Germania, quelli che ritengono che invece fosse questione fra la Russia e la Germania, e che lui nei suoi studi invece ha notato che il carattere globale della guerra e non solo quello che noi eurocentricamente situiamo da una parte all'altra o dall'altra in fondo dell'Europa, è una dimensione veramente molto più importante di quanto normalmente non si pensi. Quanto alla seconda domanda, quella su Brest-Litovsk, cioè se davvero Brest-Litovsk voleva essere una pace punitiva o se invece era solo un modo per prendere fiato per entrambi i contendenti, sia per la Russia diventata bolscevica sia per la Germania, Jörn Leonhard dice che secondo lui no, non era un modo per concentrarsi, per concentrare le forze su altri fronti, che soprattutto leggendo le testimonianze degli ufficiali tedeschi e delle fonti militari, l'idea di espansione, un po' come quella che sarebbe stata poi esposta e applicata anche diversamente, ideologicamente più caratterizzata in maniera diversa, quella del Lebensraum, era un'idea che era già presente e che doveva risolvere problemi strategici della Germania, non solo questioni immediate, di problemi relativi all'approvvigionamento di materie prime, di petrolio, e soprattutto anche il problema di gestire il fronte interno e la questione della fame, della mancanza di cibo all'interno del fronte interno. Queste ci sono altre domande? Non so quanto tempo abbiamo ancora una decina di minuti.
Posso?
Puoi.
Siccome questa conferenza è stata veramente estremamente interessante, molto molto complessa per me, quindi sicuramente molto complessa anche perlomeno per gli studenti, non parlo delle altre persone, molto complessa. Tu hai messo l'accento a un certo punto sul fatto che questa pace è stata overburdened, cioè è stata caricata di troppe aspettative. Vorrei sottolineare un punto a cui hai accennato, ma lo vorrei sottolineare perché che la pace viene siglata a Parigi dalle delegazioni che se ne stanno chiuse nei palazzi parigini e poi vanno a Versailles e festeggiavano, ballavano, bevevano e danzavano, quando tutto era già successo. Cioè tutti i nuovi stati erano già tutti nati, tra scontri, conflitti, c'erano le rivoluzioni, c'era la rivoluzione di Bela Kun in Ungheria, c'era stato il tentativo rivoluzionario in Austria, c'era stato il tentativo, la settimana di sangue a Berlino nel gennaio del 19, cioè sempre facendo un confronto col 45, no? Quando non c'è pace. Perché la Germania non firma nessuna pace dopo il 45, l'Italia sì, nel 47, ma la Germania no. Però la pace, come dire, è nei fatti, è nella distruzione ed è nel fatto che ci sono queste due poderose armate, quella sovietica e quella americana, che non è solo un'armata militare, ma l'una e l'altra portano una narrativa, come tu hai detto, molto positiva, la liberazione dell'una o dell'altra, vista dagli uni o dagli altri, contrastata reciprocamente, ma l'idea della liberazione. E invece nel 18, nel 19, tutto il casino che doveva succedere è già successo. I greci hanno invaso l'Anatolia e stanno avanzando verso Ankara. Cioè è tutto successo, e questi a Parigi sono veramente preoccupati, soprattutto i francesi della sicurezza, come tu hai detto, e la Gran Bretagna del problema dell'impero, delle flotte, e naturalmente lo spettro della rivoluzione. Però questa è veramente cioè se noi pensiamo che la pace deve essere qualche cosa che sistema le cose una volta per tutte, nel 19 le cose sono state tutte sistemate, si fa per dire, perché in realtà non sono state affatto sistemate, ma è già successo praticamente tutto quello che doveva succedere. O mi sbaglio?
That's a very good point. There's a famous speech by Clemenceau in late November 1917 in the French Assemblée Nationale, and he says, "This war is going to be won by the side that will stand 15 minutes longer than the other." And this is, I think, the prehistory of what you told. After Stalingrad, it's difficult for Germans to believe that there will be some sort of Endsieg. But most Germans in the summer of 1918 think they have won the war in the East and they are about to win the war in the West. There's a wonderful description by Sebastian Haffner, who was a teen in Berlin, and he describes how he goes to the news agent every day in August 1918 and gets news about new victories in the West. And he just anticipates that all these little victories will simply transform into the big victory, and American troops don't play any role in this, because Ludendorff had made believe Germans they are inexperienced, and we have the time window after Brest-Litovsk, and we can, in a way, change the situation. The big difference is that the defeat in 1945 is, in a way, prepared by the time after 1943. The defeat in November 1918 is not prepared, and is hence not accepted as a defeat, and is hence explained not by military responsibilities, but by the stab in the back myth. And this is, so to say, the negative narrative that will poison political cultures, not only in Germany, but in many other countries as well. Liberazione, very interesting. There is the feeling of liberation in 1918. The Irish feel liberated to fight for their state. The Poles feel liberated, but they don't do it under the auspices of Paris. They do it by starting a civil war in Ireland, and they do it, in the Polish case, by starting a war against the Russians. And this, for them, has nothing to do with the Paris Peace Conference. Yes, the Czechs feel somehow liberated, but it's, in a way, it's a completely different liberation. It's not to do with the liberation from Nazism, but it's being liberated from an empire which one didn't want to continue with. This is a different kind of ideological background and context of liberation, and it's clear that many Czechs had, in a way, found this empire rather cozy. It's a very late development that these peoples in the Habsburg Empire really say, now we want our own state. It's the people in the exile, like Masaryk and Beneš, who tell people about the secession all the time. If you look at Prague, it takes a very long time until they really give up the idea of some sort of reformed empire. That's a basic difference between 1918 and 1945. One should bear in mind, even the people who give birth to the new Yugoslavia in late 1918 think about the possible future of a Yugoslav state within the boundaries of a reform and federated Habsburg monarchy, not to speak of people like Renner. That is no option in May 1945, and that's the big difference.
Traduco anche questo. Il problema, dice che, ha ripetuto ora Jörn Leonhard, che il problema nel 18-19 è che i tedeschi pensano di avere vinto su un fronte a est e di avere perso sull'altro a ovest, e che la loro sconfitta non è preparata come invece quella post 45, ed è questo che fa veramente la differenza. Quanto all'idea di liberazione, al mito della liberazione, sì, c'era anche dopo la prima guerra mondiale in realtà questo mito della liberazione, però era una liberazione diversa e che soprattutto non era affatto collegata alla pace e al trattato di Versailles, anzi in molti ambienti, in particolare citava il caso di Praga, l'idea di impero nazionale o multinazionale era positiva, e l'idea di futuro di autodeterminazione era un'idea che conviveva con progetti di federazione del tipo di modifica dell'impero asburgico. Se volete abbiamo ancora tempo per un'ultima domanda, credo. Altrimenti io ringrazio moltissimo davvero per questo intervento densissimo e nuovo, molto nuovo, e aspetto io in particolare il progresso delle ricerche, dei lavori di Jörn Leonhard su questi temi, perché ritengo che capire e cercare di studiare come lui intende fare, in parte ha già fatto e ce l'ha mostrato qui, quali sono i limiti delle lezioni della storia e quali sono i limiti delle paci e delle tecniche, delle soluzioni che possono essere trovate per risolvere e prevenire i conflitti, sia una cosa di cui abbiamo tutti ancora molto bisogno in quest'era di conflitti grandi e piccoli, continui, che ci circondano e anzi forse si avvicinano anche a noi. Grazie.
Siamo irriducibili.